Welcome to Mindset Matters Book Club YouTube channel. Please subscribe and like to hear new book summaries.
Thanks for having me back for another deep dive.
So if I were to ask you to describe the best day of your life, you probably wouldn't describe a random Tuesday.
Right. Definitely not a Tuesday.
Yeah, I mean, you wouldn't talk about a day where you ate boring food and maybe your kid left his dirty dishes in the sink. You'd probably talk about a wedding or, a graduation, some massive milestone.
Exactly. The highlight reel.
Right. But when the unimaginable happens, the completely unremarkable, boring Tuesday actually becomes the only thing you want back. And today, we're looking at a book that really forces us to reevaluate the absolute privilege of a mundane life.
It really does.
The book is called When We See You Again, and it's written by Rachel Goldberg-Polin, with an afterword by her husband, John Polin.
Yeah, and it is just a staggering piece of literature. It serves as this unflinching, profoundly intimate memoir that documents a type of loss that frankly defies language.
It's heavy.
It is. It forces the reader to really examine the anatomy of chronic grief and ultimately what the stubborn resilience of love looks like when it's pushed to the absolute edge of human endurance.
Yeah, and I think we need to set some parameters before we even begin unpacking the text, because the backdrop of this book involves events that are globally recognized, they're incredibly fraught and fiercely debated.
Absolutely.
But our mission for this deep dive is not to dissect the geopolitics of the Middle East. That is simply not what this book is fundamentally about.
No, it's not a political textbook at all.
Right. We are here to sit with the deeply human experience of a mother and a father navigating the sudden violent loss of their child and attempting to find some sort of radiant why in the aftermath.
And to understand the emotional landscape they're navigating, we do have to outline the factual backdrop exactly as it is presented in the book.
Right. We have to lay the groundwork.
So on October 7th, 2023, Rachel and John's 23-year-old son, Hersh, was attending the Nova Music Festival. And the book recounts how terrorists attacked that festival and surrounding areas, which resulted in over 1,200 deaths.
Just incomprehensible scale.
Right. And during this attack, the book details how Hersh was hiding in a roadside bomb shelter. A grenade was thrown in, and his dominant left arm was blown off.
Oh, man.
Yeah. He was then taken hostage into Gaza, where he was held in subterranean tunnels without electricity or plumbing for 328 days.
328 days.
Yes. And the book then details the tragic conclusion, where he and 5 other hostages were executed at close range. So what we're exploring today is Rachel and John's documentation of this agonizing, really incomprehensible journey.
It's almost too much to hold in your mind at once, isn't it? It's a reality that feels so violently foreign to the average person.
It really does.
But Rachel anchors this unimaginable horror by starting the book in a place that is entirely recognizable to you and me. She doesn't begin with the attack.
Right, she starts in the before.
Exactly. She begins by painting a picture of their lives prior to October 7th. And she doesn't try to romanticize it or claim they were living some sort of perfect fairy tale. She calls it a warm beige life.
And that phrase, warm beige, it carries so much psychological weight when you view it through the rearview mirror of trauma.
How do you mean?
Well, when you are living in the warm beige, you don't recognize it as a privilege. It just feels like routine. You wake up, you go to work, you complain about minor inconveniences.
Traffic, bad coffee, whatever.
Exactly. But Rachel describes the transition out of that life violently. She writes that while they were meandering down this warm beige road, a metaphorical 18-wheeler semi-truck hit them from behind.
Wow, an 18-wheeler.
Yeah, and she says it fractured all 412 of their combined bones, mangled their spirits, and stole their hearts.
The contrast between the sheer scale of that metaphorical 18-wheeler and the quiet evening that preceded it is just difficult to digest, because the book lingers on their final normal moments on October 6th, the night before the attack.
The Friday night.
Yeah, it was a Friday, meaning it was Shabbat dinner, and reading the details of that dinner, I actually found myself getting defensive.
Defensive how?
Like almost wanting to scream at the pages to warn them.
I totally understand that because the sanctity of routine is so fragile. Rachel notes that if it had been a Sunday or Monday or Tuesday, the family of 5 likely wouldn't have all been together.
Right, they were busy.
Exactly. They were busy people pulling in different directions. But because it was Shabbat, the world artificially slowed down for them. They were together in the same room.
And the details are so brilliantly ordinary. They're laughing, they're eating beige food. Rachel makes a point to mention that Hersh was a vegetarian who somehow hated all fruits and vegetables.
Which is such a funny, specific detail.
It really is. It's so grounded. And then there's the moment where John and Rachel give Hersh the traditional Friday night blessing.
Yes, that ritual is such a cornerstone of their family dynamic. The book details how, for 23 years, every Friday and holiday, Rachel and John would place their hands on Hersh's head and bless him.
Every Friday.
Yeah, she estimates they did this over 1,000 times. And she writes about inhaling his earthy Hershey smell as she kissed the top of his head and feeling his floppy growing hair.
And then, at 11 p.m., he turns to them at the doorframe, gives a raspy, casual goodbye, and says, "Love you. See you tomorrow."
Love you. See you tomorrow.
I keep wrestling with those last words. On one hand, you could look at that and say, what an incredible gift to have those be the final words your child says to you before the world ends.
Absolutely.
But on the other hand, the casualness of it is almost cruel in retrospect, isn't it?
Yeah.
It implies a promise of a tomorrow that was violently stolen. How does someone process the dissonance of that peaceful memory against the violence that immediately followed?
Well, Rachel wrestles with that agonizing dissonance extensively throughout the book. She acknowledges that final Shabbat dinner as a profound blessing, but she also just cannot escape the torture of the timeline.
The what-ifs.
Exactly. She becomes fixated on the sequence of choices that placed Hersh in that specific bomb shelter on that specific morning. And this brings up the eternal human struggle of reconciling destiny versus chance,
Right.
which she explores through a parable called Death in Tehran.
Oh, she pulls that from Viktor Frankl's work, right? The author of Man's Search for Meaning.
Yes, exactly. And the parable is essentially a meditation on the inescapable nature of fate. It involves a king and his loyal servant walking in a garden.
Okay.
And the servant suddenly runs to the king, completely terrified, claiming he just saw death standing in the garden. So the servant begs the king for his fastest horse so he can flee immediately to the city of Tehran to escape his fate.
So he rides off.
Right, the king obliges, and the servant gallops away. Moments later, the king encounters Death in the garden and angrily demands to know why Death frightened his servant.
And what does Death say?
Death replies, "I didn't mean to scare him. I was just surprised to see him here because I have an appointment with him tonight in Tehran."
Wow. I have an appointment with him tonight.
Yeah.
In Tehran. The idea that the very act of fleeing is what delivers you to your fate.
It's a chilling concept. And Rachel applies this directly to the timeline of October 6th and 7th. She looks at all the microscopic decisions that had to align perfectly.
Like what?
Like Hersh traveling back from the north of Israel, making it home just in time for dinner, going out to meet his friend Anner, deciding in the middle of the night to drive south to the Nova Festival, and eventually running into that specific roadside bomb shelter.
All those tiny choices.
Right. She views it as destiny taking him by his one remaining hand and leading him on a 328-day trip to his own mythical Tehran.
You know, that feels like a psychological defense mechanism, honestly. I mean, if you believe it was all random chance, that if he had just hit one red light or decided he was too tired to drive south, he'd be alive that would drive a person to absolute madness. Framing it as an inescapable appointment in Tehran feels like the only way a mother could survive the what-ifs. It's almost like standing in a house that is just burned to the ground and trying to remember what the wallpaper looked like.
Yeah.
Is it a blessing or a curse that their last memory of him is so perfectly peaceful?
That's a great analogy. It is a way of creating order out of absolute chaos. Because the human brain cannot tolerate senselessness on that scale.
It shorts out.
Right. By assigning it to destiny, it removes the unbearable burden of alternative timelines. But Rachel doesn't just stop at analyzing the philosophical nature of his loss. She actively refuses to let Hersh remain an abstract concept, either to herself or to the reader.
And this is where the book really shifts into something profoundly intimate. Rachel writes a prologue chapter titled Where's Waldo?
Yes.
She describes walking around in public, looking at crowds, and constantly spotting young men who look almost like Hersh from afar. She calls them Waldo imposters.
But the crucial detail here is that she never experiences that breathless moment of false hope.
Yeah.
She writes that she actually wants to feel that confusion, that fleeting catch in her chest where she thinks, is that him? But it never happens. Because, as she puts it, she knows every inch of his movements and proportions. They are completely charred into her memory.
The level of granularity she provides is staggering. She catalogs his physical and personality traits with an almost forensic intensity.
Oh, absolutely.
She talks about his cookie eyes, where the pupils blended so perfectly into his dark chocolate irises that you couldn't distinguish them. She details his narrow size 12 feet, specifically noting how his big toe stayed aloof from the other toes, separated by exactly the width of a pencil.
She leaves nothing out. His sparse beard that he always wished was fuller. His ears, which she beautifully describes as quiet and neutral. The tiny freckle on his right cheek.
The scar, too, right?
Yes, she even documents a scar on his forehead from a cyst removal in 4th grade, recalling how the plastic surgeon promised it would eventually match a wrinkle on Rachel's own face.
She also talks about a horizontal line across his front tooth from a bike accident right after his bar mitzvah. But, I have to admit, reading this section where she catalogs not just his endearing traits, but his flaws, I actually struggled with it.
Why is that?
Well, as a parent, isn't dwelling on those microscopic details, his bad handwriting, his scab picking, just a form of self-torture? Why put yourself through archiving the fact that he was bad at washing dishes? Why not just paint a perfect picture of a saint?
To understand why she does this, we have to look at the psychology of mass tragedy and really how society consumes grief.
Okay, unpack that for me.
When someone becomes a global news story, when their face is plastered on hostage posters or they become a victim of a terror attack, the world inevitably flattens them. They cease to be a complex human being and become a two-dimensional symbol.
The hashtag.
Hashtag a cause, exactly.
They become a vessel for whatever political or social narrative the public wants to project onto them.
Precisely. And this is a recognized psychological defense mechanism for the public, too. We can't handle the emotional weight of 1,000 complex, deeply flawed human beings suffering, so our brains turn them into avatars.
It makes a lot of sense.
So Rachel's writing here is a profound act of maternal rebellion against that flattening. By documenting his terrible handwriting, how he stubbornly wrote his letters from bottom to top, ignoring the arrows on school worksheets, and his inability to wash a cutting board properly, she is archiving the messy, imperfect reality of her boy.
So it's a refusal to let him be a saint. Because a perfect saint is an abstraction, and an abstraction is easy to pity from a distance, but hard to truly mourn. You can't deeply grieve an abstraction. You grieve the boy who wouldn't stop picking at his pimples.
That is the core of it. She is forcing the reader and the world to acknowledge exactly what was stolen. It wasn't a symbol that was kidnapped. It was a young man whose resting face leaned toward boredom. A young man who went to speech therapy in kindergarten to conquer his sheesh sounds, who was passively tranquil and didn't take up too much room. She is demanding that the world look at his absolute humanity.
It's incredibly effective. You really feel like you know him. And because she paints this intimate portrait, the transition into the next part of the book is so jarring.
Very jarring.
We move from this sensory memory of a young man into the exact moment the family's reality inverted.
Yeah.
The pivot from the before to the after.
And it happens on Saturday morning, October 7th. Rachel, who observes Shabbat and doesn't use electronics during that time, is sheltering in their safe room because sirens are going off.
Right.
After an allotted 10 minutes of quiet, she goes to the kitchen, takes her phone out of the junk drawer, and turns it on just to check if Hersh is okay.
And as soon as the screen illuminates, she sees 2 WhatsApp messages from Hersh. They had come in 13 minutes earlier, both time-stamped at exactly 8:11 a.m.
Yes.
The first message says, "I love you guys." The second message says, "I'm sorry."
The terror embedded in those 2 words, "I'm sorry," when you know your son is out in the middle of nowhere during an attack, is unfathomable.
It's sickening.
Rachel writes that her throat fell on the floor. She called him, but it just rang endlessly. She texted, "Are you okay? Please tell me you are okay." And in that silence, her world ended.
Just abruptly.
Yes. She writes that everything up to that point in her life from her birth in 1969 until October 7th, 2023 was over. Abruptly. One way. No return.
The book then details the immediate aftermath, and the chaos she describes is just a masterclass in the disorientation of sudden trauma. Their apartment immediately floods with people. She doesn't even know who let them in.
Right.
And while this is universally framed as community support, Rachel experiences it as suffocating. She actually tells a friend, "You need to get all of these people out of my house. This is not a shiva. I don't want all these people all over my house."
It's important to understand the context of that statement. She specifically says, this is not a shiva.
Right. Explain that for the listeners.
For those who might not know, a shiva is the Jewish mourning period where the community comes to your home to comfort you after a confirmed death. It has rules, it has a structure, it is a contained ritual of grief.
So it's an organized process.
Exactly. And Rachel is rejecting that framework because this wasn't structured mourning. This was active, chaotic, unverified terror. She didn't know if he was dead or alive.
She mentions how agonizing the false hope was, too. People were spreading unverified lists of survivors who supposedly found refuge in nearby kibbutzim, and Hersh's name kept appearing on them.
Those rumor mills.
Yeah, they were based on who people thought they saw at the festival. She was surrounded by people telling her to stay positive, to manifest a good outcome. She felt like they were insane.
Because it wasn't grounded in reality.
Right. The only person she actually appreciated in that moment was the wife of a domestic security agent who looked her dead in the eye and delivered the blunt truth. You are not going to see him for a long time.
And that bluntness was the only thing that felt real to her amidst all the platitudes. The first day is marked by incredibly grim tasks. While false articles circulate online claiming Hersh was killed in the West Bank, John is forced to go give DNA samples. And Rachel has to go into Hersh's empty room, peel back the covers, and pick stray hairs off his pillow to give to the authorities. They are plunged into a waking nightmare, operating under the assumption by the end of the first day that their son is dead.
But then the agonizing twist. They discover he isn't dead. He is a hostage. And this necessitates a completely new, horrific phase of their lives.
The advocacy phase.
Exactly. They can't just grieve privately. They have to become public advocates. Rachel is forced onto the global stage. She travels to the United Nations in New York, to Washington, D.C., to the World Economic Forum in Davos. She is thrust into rooms with what she calls important men and powerful men.
What is particularly striking about these passages is her rapid disillusionment with global power structures. When you are in crisis, you assume the people in charge have levers they can pull to fix things.
Right, you think someone is driving the bus.
Yes. But Rachel describes meeting officials who were sympathetic but entirely powerless, and others who were incredibly powerful but completely apathetic. In Davos, she meets a powerful man who she knows is lying to her face, who she realizes doesn't care about her or Hersh at all.
He's chilling.
She notes that this was the moment she started to understand the theater of diplomacy, realizing who holds the strings to move the marionettes.
She writes about how one very important man in Washington asked her, "So how often do you speak to Hersh?"
Just incredible.
I couldn't believe I was reading that. She's
Yeah.
sitting there thinking, am I not in enough pain that I need to explain to you how being kidnapped by a terrorist organization in a war zone works? It's the absolute height of absurdity.
It reveals the profound disconnect between the people who make global decisions and the human beings who suffer the consequences of those decisions. Rachel explicitly refers to this period as the start of my acting career.
Her acting career.
Yeah. And this highlights a very dark societal dynamic regarding victimhood. Society demands that grieving victims be poised, articulate, and resilient to be palatable to politicians, the media, and the public.
If you fall apart, if you scream,
Yeah.
if you show the ugly reality of your trauma, people look away. They get uncomfortable. You have to perform your grief perfectly to earn their help.
Exactly. She tells a crowd in Washington, "We have third-degree burns on our souls." She is feeling this unbearable, visceral agony, yet she has to put on a blazer, style her hair, and politely perform diplomacy.
It's grotesque.
She's carrying a piece of paper in her bra with a Bible verse on it just to survive the degrading pat-downs by security guards at these lavish Davos mansions. It is a grotesque juxtaposition of human suffering and bureaucratic pageantry.
It's a bizarre disconnect, isn't it? It sounds like she's actively drowning, lungs burning, and everyone else is just standing dry on a dock, waving at her with life preservers.
That's it, exactly.
And somehow, she's expected to tread water, smile, and politely negotiate with them to please toss the preserver down. Here's where it gets really interesting. How does someone actively drowning manage to do that?
That analogy captures the isolation perfectly. Trauma creates an unbridgeable distance between the sufferer and the observer. At the UN, she literally tells the Security Council, "I live in a different universe than all of you. We seem like we live in the same place, but I actually live on a different planet."
To shield herself from the constant, well-meaning but exhausting questions from the public, she starts wearing a piece of tape on her shirt with a number written on it. The number of days Hersh has been held captive.
Yes.
She compares it to Jean Valjean's prison number in Les Miserables, except her prison number changed daily. Day 26, day 39, day 100. It was a silent boundary that said, Do not ask me how long it has been.
And the exhaustion of wearing that tape number, of fending off the public's need for a neat resolution, eventually forces Rachel to confront the reality of the after.
What happens when the doors close?
Right. When you finally close the door on the public, what does the actual architecture of that chronic grief look like in the quiet of your own house?
This is where the book moves past the timeline of events.
Past the advocacy.
Past the 328 days of advocacy, past the horrific news of Hersh's murder, past the massive funeral, and into the profound physical and philosophical reality of living in the aftermath.
And here, Rachel aggressively rejects the societal pressure for a tidy narrative of healing. People inherently want the story of the phoenix rising from the ashes, right?
Yeah.
We want a neat, inspiring conclusion where the family finds closure and moves on because it makes us feel safe.
Exactly. We want to know we could survive it, too.
Right. But Rachel says no. She compares her existence to Sisyphus, the figure from Greek mythology doomed to push a massive boulder up a mountain every single day, only to watch it roll back down. She writes, "I wake up and here I am again. I am Sisyphus. The pain is circular, not linear. There are no stages of grief that you conquer and leave behind." And she uses a brilliant, razor-sharp analogy involving the late actor Christopher Reeve, who was paralyzed from the neck down in a horseback riding accident.
I thought this was the most profound analogy in the entire book. She says that 500 days after his accident, no one was walking up to Christopher Reeve and asking if his severed spinal cord was better.
Right.
It would be perverse and cruel to suggest his nerves had magically reattached themselves.
She is challenging society's fundamental misunderstanding of psychological trauma. She is asking, why do we expect an irreparably fractured soul to magically heal when we would never expect an irreparably fractured spine to do the same?
That's so powerful.
She says, I will maneuver through this world permanently different. Because they cannot see inside me, people around me think I am something I am not. I am acting, pretending, faking, and lying convincingly enough that people think my fractured soul is maybe a little bit better.
It's the invisibility of it that allows people to demand healing. If her arm were missing, they wouldn't ask if it grew back.
Exactly.
To further explain this permanent alteration, she introduces a concept from Jewish law that is just, well, it takes your breath away. It's called Iver min hachai. Can you break down the origins of that term? Because it's a very visceral, almost gruesome image.
It is a gruesome image, but that gruesomeness is necessary to convey her reality. Iver min hachai translates literally to a limb from a living animal, or flesh with its soul inside it.
Okay.
It refers to an ancient biblical prohibition against a specific type of cruelty to animals, the abhorrent practice of cutting a limb off a living animal and eating it while the animal is still alive and suffering.
Wow.
And Rachel meets another bereaved mother named Esty, whose 23-year-old son died in a motorcycle accident. And Esty uses this exact archaic biblical term to describe the sensation of her grief.
Esty says, "My flesh with its soul inside of it was torn out." And Rachel instantly recognizes herself in that. They are two mothers who feel like animals who have had a massive part of their body violently chopped off, but their souls are still trapped inside the remaining mutilated body, forced to keep living.
It's brutal.
It is brutal, but it's the only metaphor that feels honest to them.
It is the truest expression of the concept of ambiguous loss and chronic grief. Rachel begins to personify grief as an uninvited third wheel. She describes it as a chronic condition, an invisible respirator they must now breathe through every second of the day.
An invisible respirator.
Yes. She imagines grief sitting patiently in a fluorescently lit waiting room with vinyl couches and a dusty plastic plant. It doesn't rage all the time. Sometimes it just waits for you.
She also shares the dreams she has, which provide this haunting counter-narrative to her waking life. For months, thanks to the sleeping pills, she has no dreams at all. But then she has one where Hersh's left arm is healed. It's a stump, but it's pink and closed and not infected. Then, right before she finds out he was killed, she dreams of a small olive tree growing out of a wooden deck in a cemetery, with a plaque bearing only his name.
Dreams in the context of trauma often serve as the subconscious trying to prepare the conscious mind for realities it cannot accept. The final dream she shares is particularly poignant.
That's the one after the funeral.
Yes, it's the only one she has after burying him. She sees Hersh as a 5-year-old boy sitting on the kitchen floor. She dives across the floor to reach him. He is mumbling something, and she keeps saying, "I can't hear you."
Oh, man.
Finally, she puts her hand on his cheek, and he looks at her and says one word: remember.
Remember. So what does this all mean for how we treat the grieving? If we actually listen to Rachel, if we internalize this architecture of grief, we have to fundamentally change how we interact with the grieving people in our own lives. We have to view grief not as an illness to be cured, but as a permanent alteration of the landscape.
Yeah.
We have to stop trying to fix people or waiting for them to get better and start sitting with them in the city of hope.
Rachel actually extends an invitation to Esty and to all bereaved parents to join her in what she calls the City of Hope. But her definition of hope is radical and redefines the word entirely.
Oh, so?
She says, "Come, my sister, let's go to the City of Hope, where we won't get better, but we will get stronger, learning to breathe with our invisible respirators. And in the City of Hope, no one will ever discuss how we are."
Hope isn't a return to the before. Hope is simply learning to carry the crushing weight of the after without being constantly interrogated by people who don't understand the physics of your burden.
Precisely. And this leads us to the culmination of their journey, because despite this crushing, permanent devastation, the book does not end in pure nihilism.
Right, they pivot again.
Rachel and John somehow manage to synthesize their absolute destruction with a desperate need to create meaning. They recognize the duality of their situation.
They recognize they have a choice, as impossible as it seems. As Moses says in the Bible, choose life. But Rachel admits she has to aggressively sell the idea to herself. She writes, "I don't want just any life. I want a beautiful life. I don't want this tragic disaster to make me ugly, to turn me bitter, brittle, and chipped."
But how do you prevent that?
Exactly. How do you integrate this immense, overflowing love for Hersh when the physical object of that love is gone?
She comes to a profound realization about the nature of moving forward. She realizes that wanting to get over her grief, wanting the pain to lessen, is actually a betrayal of her love.
A betrayal.
Yes, she says it's like wanting to euthanize part of ourselves just to make navigating the world easier or to make other people more comfortable. She quotes a line from J.D. Salinger's Franny and Zooey, which states that the quintessential experience in life is to continue to love beyond life.
Continuing to love beyond life. She gave a eulogy at Hersh's memorial that really distills this entire philosophy. She said, "We are born, we live, and then we leave. What is left behind can be a legacy, a lesson, a breeze, or nothing, if we are honest, usually nothing at all, except love." You didn't get the memo.
Except love.
Yeah, the love outruns the tragedy.
Right.
It defies the physical finality of the grave.
And John Polin's afterword brings this philosophy into a razor-sharp, agonizing focus. He writes a direct letter to Hersh. In it, he shares an incredibly painful detail about attending synagogue.
Remember this part.
During the priestly blessing, the Birkat Kohanim, there is a tradition where fathers cover themselves and their sons under a large prayer shawl, a talit, to receive the blessing together. For 23 years, John and Hersh shared over 1,000 intimate moments cloaked in that specific privacy.
John writes about how Hersh, when he was older and taller, would rest his weary head on John's shoulder under the talit, and they would chuckle at quiet jokes while the congregation prayed. And now, John stands in the synagogue, looking around at all the other fathers embracing their sons under the shawls, and he stands entirely alone with tears in his eyes. The visceral loneliness of that image of standing under a tent built for two, entirely alone, is staggering.
It is the physical manifestation of the amputated soul. But John refuses to let that loneliness be the final punctuation mark of their story. He explicitly draws on Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning, the same author who wrote the Death in Tehran parable we discussed earlier.
Yes, Frankl.
Frankl, who survived the Holocaust, built his entire psychological framework on the belief that finding meaning in unavoidable suffering is the highest human achievement. John states that for him, Rachel, and their daughters, finding a radiant WHY is absolutely mandatory for their physical and psychological survival.
It's sheer defiance. They refuse to let their anguish become an anchor that pulls them underwater permanently.
Yeah.
Instead, they're doing the impossible work of turning it into a compass. And we see that radiant WHY already manifesting in the world through the legacy projects created in Hersh's name.
The community projects.
Yeah. John tells Hersh in the letter about initiatives like Hersh's Fridges in Chicago. These are community refrigerators that provide free, kosher food to people experiencing food insecurity, offering it with dignity and discretion.
John also writes about a seemingly minor but profoundly impactful interaction with a stranger on the street in the summer of 2025.
Oh, this was incredible.
This man stopped John, pulled out his phone, and showed him that his home screen was a picture of Hersh. The man told John, "Every morning, the first thing I see is this picture of Hersh, and I start each day by asking myself what I can do today to be better, to make the world better."
That is the emotional alchemy at work. John and Rachel are taking the heavy, toxic lead of ultimate violence, of senseless terror and loss, and through sheer, stubborn force of will, they are transforming it into the gold of community service, deep empathy, and global connection.
It is an act of sheer defiance. They are looking at the universe and saying, you broke every bone in our bodies, you stole our son, but you do not get to dictate how we love him moving forward. Rachel says she will outrun her own love to get to him when she sees him again.
That imagery.
She envisions that reunion with such blinding clarity, writing, I will need all four of you to hold me up because my knees will not know how to lock. They will be so filled with gleeful jelly.
Gleeful jelly. It's a breathtaking conclusion to an unimaginable journey. They have archived his humanity, survived the surreal public spectacle of their private nightmare, accepted the permanence of their amputated souls, and decided that their enduring love is the only compass that matters now.
If we pull all of these threads together, we see a roadmap not just for surviving catastrophic loss, but for understanding the human condition.
Right, from start to finish.
We started in the warm beige of the before, a life of blessed routine that was taken for granted. We move through the desperate archiving of a boy's messy humanity, his cookie eyes and his bad handwriting. We witnessed the chaotic theater of the after, where trauma forced a mother to negotiate with the world's powerful men.
The acting career.
Right. And finally, we arrived at the architecture of chronic grief, where the expectation of healing is discarded in favor of enduring through a defiant, radiant love.
The book leaves us with a hauntingly beautiful concept, that grief is just love with nowhere to go. And if that's true, I want you to consider the people in your own life right now. Are you waiting for a metaphorical 18-wheeler to hit you from behind before you realize the incredible, staggering value of your own warm beige routine?
Don't wait for the 18-wheeler.
Exactly. What if you decided to catalog their cookie eyes, their annoying habits, and their messy handwriting today? Not as a memorial, but as an act of aggressive, present-tense gratitude.
Notice the beige. Hold on to the quirks. Stop expecting the broken to easily heal and let love be the final reality.
Thank you for joining us in this deep dive into When We See You Again. We'll see you next time.